Clara Doyle knew the sound of every floorboard in the Granger Hotel. She knew the particular groan of the third step on the main staircase and the high-pitched squeal the kitchen door made when the air was damp with the promise of rain. After 2 years, these were the sounds of her life, the small, predictable noises that marked the passage of her days from the pre-dawn chill to the bone-deep weariness of night. She had arrived in Calvert County, Colorado, a slip of a girl all of 22, with a face pale from the ship and a heart heavy with the green hills of Ireland she'd left behind. Now, at 24, the mountain sun had put a touch of color in her cheeks, but the quiet watchfulness in her eyes remained. She was a housemaid. It was a respectable position, one that kept a roof over her head and food in her belly, but in the rigid hierarchy of a town like Calvert, it placed her in a specific, unchangeable box. She was part of the machinery that made life comfortable for others. She was the clean linen, the polished silver, the swept floor. She was meant to be present but unseen, efficient but unheard. The daughters of the town's merchants and bankers saw her, of course. They saw her in the way one sees a piece of furniture that has always been there. Their whispers followed her down the hotel corridors, not precisely cruel, but laced with the easy, unthinking condescension of those who had never had to scrub a floor on their hands and knees. They spoke of her as the Irish Maid, a designation that was both a fact and a judgment. They laughed among themselves at the idea of her having ambitions, of her dreaming. To them, a maid with dreams was the most amusing sort of folly, like a plow horse wishing it were a thoroughbred. Clara heard the whispers. She felt the weight of their gazes. She learned to keep her own eyes lowered, to make her expression a placid mask, to move through their world as if she were a ghost. Her dignity was a small, hard thing she kept polished in the quiet of her own mind. It was all she had. Eli Voss was a different sort of fixture in Calvert County. Where Clara was invisible, he was seen by everyone. He was the son of John Voss, whose ranch sprawled across the best grazing land in the territory. But Eli was not just his father's son. He had a reputation of his own, built on hard work and a quiet, unshakable steadiness. He was a man who seemed carved from the same solid, enduring material as the mountains that framed the valley. He was, by unanimous and unspoken agreement among the mothers of Calvert, the most sought-after man for 100 miles. Clara knew of him the way she knew of the mayor or the sheriff. He was a public figure, a part of the town's landscape. She saw him ride down the main street on a handsome bay gelding, his posture straight, his hat pulled low. He moved with a purpose that suggested he always knew exactly where he was going. He was handsome, she supposed, in a rugged, sun-weathered way, but his world was so far removed from hers that his existence was of no more personal consequence to her than the phases of the moon. Then, one Tuesday morning in early May, the world shifted. She was in the hotel kitchen, polishing a tray of silver spoons, the familiar scent of lye soap and yesterday's bread in the air. Mrs. Gable, the hotel cook and Clara's only confidant, was kneading a mountain of dough with her powerful, flour-dusted arms. The back door squealed open, letting in a shaft of bright morning light and the sound of boots on the stone step. It was Eli Voss. He filled the doorway, his broad shoulders seeming to shrink the already cramped space. He removed his hat, holding it in his hands. His hair was the color of dark honey, catching the light. "Morning, ladies," he said. His voice was a low, pleasant rumble. "Mrs." Gable wiped her hands on her apron. "Mr. Voss, what can we do for you? You're a long way from the dining room." "I was hoping I might trouble you for a cup of coffee," he said, his eyes briefly touching on Clara before settling back on the cook. "The pot up front tastes like it was boiled with a rusty nail." A faint smile touched Mrs. Gable's lips. "I keep the good coffee back here for myself. Have a seat." He took a seat at the small, scrubbed pine work table, placing his hat beside him. Clara kept her head bowed, her focus intent on a single tarnished spoon. She could feel his presence in the room as a physical weight. The air seemed thicker, charged with something new and unsettling. She polished the spoon until the metal grew warm beneath her fingers, her own reflection staring back at her, distorted and strange. "Mrs." Gable poured him a mug of coffee, black and steaming. He thanked her and drank it slowly, in no apparent hurry. The only sounds were the rhythmic thud of Mrs. Gable's dough and the frantic, silent polishing of the spoon in Clara's hands. He finished the coffee, placed the empty mug on the table, and stood. "My thanks, Mrs. Gable. That's the best coffee in the state." He put on his hat, gave a slight nod that included them both, and was gone. The kitchen door squealed shut behind him. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Mrs." Gable stopped her kneading and looked at her, a knowing glint in her eye. "Well now." Clara said nothing, simply picked up another spoon. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. It became a ritual. He would appear just after sunrise, take his seat at the pine table, and drink a single cup of coffee. He rarely said more than a few words of greeting and thanks. He never addressed Clara directly, but she felt his gaze on her as she worked. She learned the sound of his breathing, the way he rested his large, calloused hands on the table, the quiet concentration on his face as he stared into his cup. It was, she told herself, nothing. A man wanted a decent cup of coffee. That was all. It had nothing to do with her. To think otherwise was to indulge in the kind of foolish dreaming the town's daughters mocked her for. She fortified her heart against the thought, building a wall of practicality and common sense. But the whispers in the hotel lobby changed their tune. They grew sharper, more pointed. "Did you see him?" Beatrice Croft, the banker's daughter, said one afternoon, her voice carrying clearly into the hall where Clara was dusting. "He walks right past the dining room every day. Straight to the kitchen. My father says he's just being kind," added Evelyn Hayes, whose father owned the mercantile. "You know, charity for the help." The words were like small, sharp stones. Clara's back stiffened, but she gave no sign she had heard. She just kept dusting, her movements precise and mechanical. One morning she arrived at the hotel to find the heavy wooden latch on the kitchen garden gate split and broken. She struggled with it, trying to secure it against the wind, but the splintered wood wouldn't hold. She would have to tell the manager, Mr. Granger, and hope he would get around to fixing it before the week was out. She gave up and went inside, her hands raw from the effort. The next day, the gate swung open smoothly and shut behind her with a satisfying click. A new latch, made of heavy, black iron, had been expertly fitted to the frame. The screws were new, the work clean and solid. There was no note, no explanation. "Mrs." Gable was already at the stove. She glanced at Clara's face as she entered. "Looks like we have a handy ghost in the garden," the cook said, her tone dry. Clara's heart did a strange, fluttering little dance. She pressed her lips together and went to the sink to wash her hands. It was a latch, a simple piece of hardware. It meant nothing, but she knew who had fixed it. She had seen hands like that, strong, capable, familiar with tools and wood and iron, resting on the pine table every morning. It was an unspoken gesture, a quiet act of care that slipped past the walls she had so carefully built around her heart. It was more dangerous than any spoken word. Eli, for his part, considered the matter of the coffee to be a perfectly logical arrangement. The coffee in the hotel dining room was terrible. The coffee in the kitchen was good. Therefore, he drank his coffee in the kitchen. It was simple. The fact that Clara Doyle was also in the kitchen was a pleasant coincidence, one that grew less coincidental with each passing day. He had noticed her long before he started his morning visits. He had seen her on the street, a small, dark-haired figure moving with a quiet efficiency that stood out against the bustling backdrop of the town. She never dawdled, never gossiped on street corners. She had a certain grace, a self-contained dignity that he found compelling. He watched the way she worked, the focused economy of her movements, whether she was sweeping the hotel porch or polishing the brass fittings on the main doors until they shone. There was a substance to her that the other young women in town, with their frills and their laughter and their endless frivolous talk, seemed to lack. He was a man who understood value. He knew good land, good horses, good people. He recognized quality when he saw it. And he saw it in the Irish maid with the watchful eyes and the hands that were never still. His father, a shrewd and practical man who rarely missed a thing, noticed his son's new routine. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the main ranch house, watching the last of the sun bleed out behind the peaks, he brought it up. "I hear you've taken a liking to the coffee at the Granger Hotel," John Voss said, not looking at his son. "It's a decent cup," Eli replied, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "I also hear that Beatrice Croft's father has been making inquiries. He seems to think you and his daughter would make a fine match. She would bring a considerable dowry with her." Eli was silent for a long moment, the only sound the chirping of crickets in the tall grass. "Beatrice Croft is a fine woman," he said finally, his voice even. "But she is not the woman for me." His father turned to look at him then, his expression serious. "A man in your position needs to think about these things, son. You're not getting any younger. You need a wife, a family, to carry on what we've built here." It was this conversation, overheard through the thin glass of an open kitchen window, that changed everything for Clara. She had been sent to polish the brass handles on the side entrance, a task she normally disliked but now performed with a numb, automatic precision. The voices came from the alleyway, low and clear in the still afternoon air. She heard Eli's response, and the words seemed to stop the very beating of her heart. "I appreciate the thought, Father, and I have been thinking on it. But I've already found the woman I mean to ask. She works the morning shift right here at the hotel." Clara froze, her hand hovering over the brass plate, the polishing cloth clutched in her fingers. Her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. It was a mistake. There were other women who worked the morning shift in the dining room, in the laundry. She heard the surprise in the older man's voice. "The hotel? One of the dining room girls?" "No, sir," Eli said, and his voice was calm and steady as a rock. "The housemaid, Miss Doyle." A profound silence followed. Clara felt as if the entire world was holding its breath. She imagined Mr. Voss's disapproval, his shock. A rancher's son and a housemaid. It was the stuff of foolish novels, not real life in Calvert County. But John Voss was a man who trusted his son's judgment above all else. "Well," he said, after a long pause, "you always were one to know your own mind." Clara leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the doorframe, her knees suddenly weak. She felt a dizzying mix of terror and a wild, soaring hope that was so unfamiliar it felt like pain. He had said her name. He had told his father. This was not a passing fancy. It was an intention. The weeks leading up to the annual Founders' Day celebration were a torment for her. Eli's morning visits continued, unchanged. He still sat in his quiet contemplation over a single cup of coffee. But now, the silence in the kitchen was filled with the deafening echo of the words she had overheard. She could not meet his eyes. She was afraid of what she might see there, and even more afraid of what he might see in hers. The town was buzzing with preparations for the celebration, and with gossip. It seemed everyone knew of Eli Voss's strange mourning habit. The consensus among the town's leading ladies was that he was merely amusing himself, and that on Founders' Day, he would finally make his intentions clear by choosing a proper partner, Beatrice Croft, most likely for the evening's dance. Clara had no intention of going. The thought of standing alone at the edge of the festivities, enduring the pitying glances and sharp whispers, was more than she could bear. It was safer to remain in the quiet solitude of her small room. "You're not going?" Mrs. Gable asked her 2 days before the event, her hands busy peeling potatoes. It's not for the likes of me, Clara said, her voice tight. Mrs. Gable fixed her with a stern look. Nonsense. A body has a right to see the fireworks and hear the band. You let those silly little hens cluck you into a corner, and you'll spend your whole life there. You put on your best dress and you hold your head up. You have as much right to be there as any of them. The cook's words struck a chord of defiance in Clara's heart. Why should she hide? She had done nothing wrong. She had worked hard, lived honestly. Her pride, the very thing that had been her armor for so long, would not allow her to be shamed into hiding. She would go. Founders' Day dawned bright and clear. The entire population of Calvert County seemed to have gathered in the town square, which was festooned with red, white, and blue bunting. The air was thick with the smell of roasted pork and fresh-cut grass, and the sound of a brass band tuning up near the gazebo. Clara wore her Sunday dress, a simple garment of dark blue wool, her hair neatly pinned up. She felt plain and drab next to the other girls in their fashionable dresses of printed calico and crisp linen adorned with ribbons and lace. She found a spot near the back of the crowd, partially shielded by a large oak tree, determined to be present but inconspicuous. She was a spectator, nothing more. She saw Eli arrive with his father. He looked different out of his work clothes, dressed in a well-cut dark suit and a starched white shirt. He looked taller, more formidable. He was immediately engulfed by the town's most prominent citizens. Beatrice Croft, radiant in a dress the color of buttercups, managed to position herself at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Clara's heart sank. This was it. This was the reality of the world. A banker's daughter and a rancher's son. It was the natural order of things. The conversation she had overheard must have been a fleeting notion, a moment of fancy that had passed. She had been a fool to let that seed of hope take root. A bitter disappointment settled in her chest, cold and heavy. She told herself it was for the best. It was safer this way. She watched as the mayor gave a long-winded speech. She watched as people laughed and talked. She watched Beatrice Croft look up at Eli Voss with an expression of open adoration. And she watched Eli. His face was polite, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were scanning the crowd. He was looking for someone. Then his gaze found her. Across the entire expanse of the town square, through the throng of people, his eyes met hers. For a heartbeat, the noise and the motion of the celebration faded away. There was only the intense, steady focus of his look. It was not a casual glance. It was a destination. He said something to his father, then gently disengaged his arm from Beatrice Croft's grasp, leaving her with a polite nod. And then he started walking. A path seemed to clear before him as if by magic. He walked with that same unhurried purpose she had seen 100 times. He walked past the mayor and his wife. He walked past the Hayes family, who stared in disbelief. He walked past a cluster of young women, their laughter dying on their lips as they turned to watch him. The murmur of the crowd began to subside, replaced by a spreading, expectant silence. Every step he took was a drumbeat against Clara's heart. He was walking toward her. He was crossing a social chasm as wide and deep as a canyon, and he was doing it in front of everyone. He stopped directly in front of her. The toes of his polished boots were inches from the hem of her worn wool skirt. The entire town of Calvert was watching them, silent and rapt. He smelled of soap and clean linen, and the faint, masculine scent of the outdoors. He held out his hand. It was a large, strong hand, the hand that had fixed her gait, the hand that had held a coffee mug in her kitchen every morning. "Miss Doyle," he said. His voice was not loud, but in the profound hush it carried to every corner of the square. "Would you allow me to escort you to the festivities?" Clara stared at his outstretched hand. To take it was to accept everything it implied. It was a public declaration, a choice from which there would be no turning back. In that moment, she was not just a housemaid, she was a woman being chosen openly and deliberately by the most eligible man in the county. She saw the stunned, furious expression on Beatrice Croft's face, the open-mouthed shock of her friends, the astonished curiosity of the entire town. To say yes was to step out of the shadows and into a blinding spotlight. It was terrifying. Her hesitation was not born of doubt in him, but of a deep, instinctual understanding of the finality of the act. This was a threshold, and once crossed, the world would never look the same. He must have seen the storm of emotion in her eyes. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping so that only she could hear it, a low, intimate rumble that cut through her fear. "This is not for them," he said, his gaze holding hers, steady and true. "This is for me, and only if you choose it." His words were an anchor in the swirling sea of her uncertainty. He was giving her the choice. He was respecting her, even now, in this moment of grand public display. It was not a performance. It was a genuine question, offered from his heart to hers. She looked from his hand to his face, at the earnest, waiting expression in his clear, gray eyes. And the fear dissolved, replaced by a quiet, powerful certainty. She had spent 2 years making herself small, making herself invisible to survive. But this man saw her. He had seen her all along. She drew in a slow breath and lifted her own hand, placing it in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and firm. "I choose it," she said, her voice a whisper that was, for him, as loud as a shout. A collective gasp went through the crowd as he drew her hand into the crook of his arm and turned to lead her into the heart of the celebration. The whispers that followed them now were of a different nature, entirely no longer of mockery, but of pure, unadulterated astonishment. Clara kept her eyes fixed forward, her head held high, feeling the solid warmth of his arm linked with hers. She was no longer on the edge of the world. She was at its very center. Their courtship was as direct and honest as the man himself. It was not a thing of flowery words or grand poetic gestures. It was built of simpler, sturdier materials. It was the long walks they took on Sunday afternoons, following the creek that ran behind the town, their conversation easy and unforced. She told him of the small village in County Cork she had left behind, of the ache for a home that was no longer hers. He told her of his love for the land, the satisfaction of seeing a new calf take its first breath, the quiet peace of riding the fence line at dawn. He took her to the Voss ranch, a sprawling, prosperous place that intimidated her at first. But John Voss, his father, greeted her not as a housemaid, but as his son's choice. He treated her with a gruff but genuine respect, his sharp eyes assessing her and apparently finding her worthy. They were married in October, when the aspen trees on the mountainsides had turned a brilliant, shimmering gold. The ceremony was held in the small clapboard church, the pews filled with the curious and the well-wishing citizens of Calvert. Mrs. Gable sat in the front row, weeping quietly into a lace handkerchief. Beatrice Croft was not in attendance. Clara wore a dress of deep blue linen that she had sewn herself, the color reminding her of the twilight sky over the mountains. Eli stood beside her, solid and sure, his hand holding hers, a silent promise of a lifetime of steadiness. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Eli did not kiss her with fiery passion, but with a gentle, reverent tenderness that spoke more of devotion than any grand display ever could. 7 years later, Clara Voss sat on the porch of the home Eli had built for her, a sturdy, handsome house nestled in a valley on the west side of the ranch. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The mountains were silhouetted against a sky streaked with purple and rose. 2 children played in the yard, their laughter bright in the fading light. A boy of 6, with his father's steady gray eyes and a shock of dark hair, was carefully building a tower of stones. His sister, a lively 4-year-old with Clara's dark curls and a mischievous smile, was trying to catch fireflies in a glass jar. Eli came out of the house and handed Clara a steaming mug. She took a sip. It was tea, sweet and milky, just the way she liked it. He sat in the chair beside her, his own mug of coffee in his hand. He looked out at their children, a deep contentment settling on his features. "Still not coffee," he said, a familiar, gentle tease in his voice. She smiled, the expression easy and natural. "You drank enough of that in Mrs. Gable's kitchen to last us both a lifetime." He reached over and took her free hand, his fingers lacing through hers. The feel of his touch was as familiar and necessary to her as breathing. It was the same hand that had reached for her across a crowded town square, the same hand that had offered her a new life. "I was thinking about that day," he said quietly, his gaze still on the yard. "Founders' Day. The whole town was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop." A faint blush rose in her cheeks, even after all these years. "I was terrified," she admitted. "I thought my heart was going to beat its way right out of my chest." He turned to look at her then, his eyes full of a love that was as deep and constant as the mountains themselves. "I know," he said softly. "You were the bravest person there." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. He had seen her strength when she had only felt her fear. He had seen her worth when others had seen only her station. He was her husband, her partner, her home. He had been slow and deliberate and sure, and he had been worth the wait. Together, they watched the first stars begin to prick the darkening sky, their shared silence as comfortable and meaningful as any words could ever be. That was the thing about a quiet love. It didn't need to shout. Its strength was in its steadiness, in the unspoken gestures and the shared quiet, a foundation built not on the shifting sands of public opinion, but on the solid rock of two souls who simply and truly saw one another. It was a love that lasted, a love that built a life, a love that was, in the end, the only kind that truly mattered.